This is what we hope to be the first of an annual. We completely redid the format for this year. So I want to say a couple words about that. But first, I want to get a sense of where we all are from. So Minnesota, you want to raise your hand? All right. Nearer to Minnesota, raise your hand. Far away from Minnesota, I'm really glad you are. Awesome. All right, how about this? Will the Methodists please stand up? All right, Methodists, woo! That way you can find each other and, have lunch together, and because you wouldn't want to talk with the Episcopalians, which, by the way, are they standing? Are they here, Episcopalians? Woo! Anglican. Excellent. Matt wants to know where all the Presbyterians are. We want to stand up? Wow. Look at that. I know for a fact that we have some Canadians. Stand up. Look at it. Awesome. That's great. And UCC. I know UCC. All right. And I also know that there is at least one Disciples of Christ. Yay! So you guys can hang out, right? And how about the Lutherans? There they are. A couple Lutherans. That warms Rolf's heart to see the Lutherans out there. Okay, who did I not call? What else? Yeah. Non-denominationals, please stand up. Woo! And Rich? RCA. Baptist. Woo! This is fantastic. We are so excited to have so many different denominations and so many different places represented. So thank you again for being here. A few comments about the format. Last year, we realized that we could keep doing what we're doing and people would still come, but recognize that there was maybe another need in the preaching world besides coming to conferences and listening to preachers and listening to lectures on preaching. That we began to think, what is another way that we can organize a conference around what it is that goes behind the scenes of preaching? And so this whole conference is what is going on behind the scenes, right? What are some of those main things that you have to think about each and every week? What are some of those skills that you've been wanting to work on in your preaching? And so we basically blew up the whole celebration and started over. And yesterday we started with a pre-conference masterclass, which filled up almost immediately. And so for those brave souls who preached for Anna, Jana, Tom, and me yesterday, there were 48 of you. Do you want to stand up? There you go. So Anna, Jana, Tom, and I listened to 12 sermons yesterday. But it was fantastic listening to the kinds of things that you all are working on. What are some of the skills and techniques about sermon preparation or about preaching that you recognize, yeah, these are some things I want to work on. This is what I'm trying to do in my sermon. Could you listen for this and help me out? We very, very rarely, if ever, get an opportunity to preach for each other and to help each other and to think about how we can come alongside each other and help each other in our preaching and grow in our preaching. So this whole conference is based on that. So, of course, what we have today is a Sermon Brainwave. We started with Sermon Brainwave, and we were really mixing it up, right? Sermon Brainwave first, with my colleagues Matt Skinner and Rolf Jacobson. Hello. Hi. So we're doing a live Sermon Brainwave, and then a behind-the-scenes conversation with the three of us, hosted by Larry Strenge. who will ask us sort of what goes on in that pod down in the basement of Bachman, which some of you got to see, Sermon Brainwave headquarters. So what goes on? How do we get to where we are able to think about these texts for the sake of preaching? And then all of our sermons this time are preached, of course, by our guest preachers. We have Anna Carter-Florence, Tom Long, and Janet Childers. But we brought them in specifically because they probably 75 years total of teaching homiletics, at least, if you add up all of their years together. And so we brought them in, and what they're going to do after their sermon is to take us behind the scenes of that sermon. How did they get to how did they get to that sermon? What are the things with which they struggled? What were some of the things that they had to think about? What is their sermon process besides prayer? Right? How does that happen? Prayer and praying desperately for the Holy Spirit to show up. All right, so what are some of those aspects? And then we'll have plenty of time for question and answers. And this is also another aspect about this conference that we're really excited about, because again, when do you get an opportunity to talk with some of these preachers and really get into how do we do this? What are sort of the nuts and bolts with this? So that is the nature of the conference. A couple of other announcements, that we have a beer and hymns tonight at Dubliner Pub, so there's more information out there. I'll have some more announcements later on this morning.
Anybody like to sing?
Sorry. I do.
Anybody like beer?
Wine? They have wine, don't they?
They have a full bar.
Okay, awesome. Right. Am I bringing my violin? Oh, I have to think about that.
You might have to.
I might have to. Either that or sing. Anyway, love to see you there. But again, welcome. Thanks for experimenting with us. Thanks for taking a chance on this conference and see what happens. And we will now begin with our live Sermon Brainwave. Okay, thanks again.
Are you going to...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it okay? Should we turn off our cell phones? Please put your cell phones on airplane mode. Airplane mode.
Wait,
yeah. It won't do anything. Is it okay to...
Yeah. It's fine. Oh, is that fine? Okay. Okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay, so this is a live Sermon Brainwave. And it is also we're doing both audio live and video live, which is why he's wearing a sweater. And we've never done the video live before. This is the first time. So, and both of them will be accessible on the website. And then we will follow our live Sermon Brainwave with a Q&A podcast. Which will again be hosted by Larry Strenge. And that will also be live, both video and audio, and also posted on our workingpreacher.org site. So again, we're experimenting with some things with Sermon Brainwave. But you are a significant part of this live experience, so we need to do a little rehearsal, okay? So if you have been here before, you know what I'm talking about. Because we always introduce ourselves at the beginning of each podcast. Welcome to Sermon Brainwave with me, Karoline Lewis.
And me, Rolf Jacobson.
And me, Matt Skinner.
And then we need you to say, and us.
And us.
Right? Is that what you said? Yeah. That's it. Okay. Good. That was really good. Okay, great. And you get to read the text?
Yes.
So that is perfect. And you can laugh. You're happy. We welcome laughter. Crying, not so much. But we love you to...
Hissing. No hissing. The microphone will pick that up really easily.
Yeah. We love you to laugh. You can clap. You can do whatever you want. This is a live experience. And so we need you to, be involved. So how we usually do this is we gather in our pod, And I usually bring coffee for Rolf and me, not for Matt because he doesn't drink coffee. And we start with a brief conversation around the text. What do we want to start with? Which text do we want to start with? Do we see some sort of themes that we want to lift out? Do we have sort of a basic order that we want to go through with the texts? But we don't script it. So we really want it to be truly a text study where we're getting together and thinking about the text together. So we each do our own work. We read the commentaries that are on the website. I translate all of the New Testament's text in Greek, and no, I don't. And well, I read them. I know you do. And we do our own work. We do our own thinking about the text. We take notes, and then we come together and just map it out a little bit to see where we want to go, so we have some sort of direction. And then we talk about who gets to read the text, because that's always the highlight of the podcast. And today it's
my turn.
Rolf's turn. We rotate, okay, so that whoever we change every time who gets to read the text, and then we get started. So that's a little bit of behind the scenes of how we get going on this. Anything else I've missed? Gentlemen?
The timer.
The timer. This is so that we don't get going too long. We usually try for about 20 to 25 minutes. Sometimes it's 30, depending on who talks a lot. All right? So, and we did have our conversation prior, so I think we know where we're going, right? We have a sense of that? Okay, good. Are you all ready? Yes. Okay, I'm not quite. Hold on. I need a Bible. There you go. Oh, and also I need to share with you this is like my best friend. You all have this, right? This is like the RCL, the church year texts. So if we want to know like what's going on, I keep that. So it's always in my podcast file. So yeah. Okay, so are we ready, Gunn? We are ready. Okay, are you all both ready? Are you all ready? Yes. Woo! Okay, here we go. Am I starting?
I go third.
You go third. So I should go in the middle, so you should go first.
All right. Okay. Welcome to Sermon Brainwave with me, Matt Skinner.
And me, Karoline Lewis.
And me, Rolf Jacobson.
Who are all these people?
This is a live. Let's start over.
Okay, one more time. See, we do have to start over every once in a while. All right, here we go.
Welcome to Sermon Brainwave with me, Matt Skinner.
And me, Karoline Lewis.
And me, Rolf Jacobson.
Rolf, who are these people?
This is the podcast for October 16th, 2016, the 22nd Sunday after Pentecost, and we are recording a live Sermon Brainwave from the Craft of Preaching at Luther Seminary.
And thank you all for being here.
So the texts for this week are, the thematic Old Testament reading is Genesis 32, 22 through 31. The semi-continuous Old Testament reading is Jeremiah 31, 27 through 34, Psalm 121. 2 Timothy 3:14 through 4:5 is the second reading, and the gospel reading is Luke 18, 1 through 8.
I'm just going to say I love this parable. I love this gospel text. I'm so happy it comes like 3 weeks before Election Day. I couldn't be happier.
And why is that?
It's a great text, right? It's about contending with God. It's about the character of God. It's also, in some ways, about the nature of Christian faith, or about the longing of faith, and maybe even about a kind of activism that's built into faith. So I love the imagery. I love what it does. So bring it on,
well, say
skeptics.
Yeah, it's good. Say a little bit more about the character of God. Like, what does it reveal about God?
Well, I think the form of the parable is this classic "how much more" you see a lot in the Bible. Paul loves this way of arguing as well. if this relatively powerless and insignificant person, this widow, can even leverage an unjust judge, this total scoundrel, to grant justice, how much more will a loving God do that for the people that God cares about? So it's a pretty simple, the logic, the theological logic is pretty simple and basic, where, if even somebody this bad can be moved for whatever reason, and the end result is justice or satisfaction, how much more so would a loving God? So it's the basis of the parable is playing on that, but at the same time, I think it also subtly acknowledges the fact that we often experience God as very much like an unjust judge, in the sense that God seems silent so often, that God seems disinclined to grant justice as we want it or according to our timetable. So it plays with both the God we're supposed to believe in, loving, good, giving good gifts to God's children, but it also plays into, at least my experience, of frustration or wondering or longing.
Of where God is in our injustice.
Yeah, and so I pray and lose heart all the time, but the parable tells me not to, but I still am prone to do that. And so it just allows some honest discussion about that, I think.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we want to keep in mind with this parable, too, is that the lectionary skips 17:20 through 37. And I'm not going to say add those verses, although I often do, to add verses. I never want to subtract, I always want to add. But that section of Luke of really starting to point toward when is the kingdom coming, and when is what does the kingdom look like, and when will it appear? And so you do have this time is coming, and of course we're getting closer to chapter 19, which will be Jerusalem. And so there is a sort of sense of what does it look like, or what kind of life do we live, or what kind of behavior do we need to have, or what kind of stance toward God do we need to have when we're in the midst of injustice and we're in the midst of waiting for this kingdom to come. And so there is this character of faith or character of discipleship that suggests a certain kind of persistence or tenacity toward but particularly, I think one of the things we have to be careful with this parable is that it's not just pray more, just keep praying, keep praying. Yes, it's in part about prayer, but it's this recognizing that prayer brings about, particularly this parable, prayer brings about justice. Prayer brings about God's justice on earth, and so there's a distinctiveness and a particularity, I think, to what is it that we need to be praying for in the midst of potential, absence of God, that God reveals God's self and God's justice.
Which is what? So, on the one hand, you're saying that there's an eschatological setting for this. So it's about bringing about God's ultimate consummation of things. Yeah. But at the same time, there's the daily need or the daily longing for justice, and it's more maybe temporary or local forms. So you're trying to say it's both. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think I am.
I was not excited to see this parable for this particular. Well, actually, I just could end it there. Because a couple of things. One is just the obviously problematic promise of the parable seems to be if you bug God day and night, then God will grant justice. And therefore, then pushing the parable beyond where you can push it, if you don't get justice, you didn't bug God enough, which is, I think, how a lot of folks hear a text like this, and I don't know the answer to that. Do you, Matt?
No, but I'm not so sure it implies that. I'm not so sure it implies the opposite, that if you didn't pray, it's your fault, that things are bad. I think I think the force of it is more positive. I think the widow stands out in this, not just for her desperation, and the Gospels sometimes, I think, equate faith with desperation or characterize faith for some folks as desperation, but she also stands out in her willingness to put herself out there, to risk humiliation or embarrassment or further disempowerment for the sake of, it's not clear that she's humiliating this judge, whatever, but she knows what's gonna work. And so she doesn't necessarily expect a fair legal system. I mean, this is why it's such a timely parable in some ways, is I think a lot of us know what an unfair legal system looks like. And so what's the role of people in faith in that kind of a system? Some people have power to change systems, others don't. This woman doesn't. And so, I mean, it's just, I'm not so sure that Luke's audience would have heard it that way, but it strikes me as really resonant for the way in which her faith is more than just being demure. Her faith is more than just believing the right things, but her faith is actually strategic in a particular way.
And exposure.
I just like that.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. It's also exposure in that the character who demonstrates this kind of tenacity or this kind of stance toward God or stance toward the judge is a widow. So she's already in an incredibly vulnerable place in society, and yet she takes this step toward more vulnerability and more sort of exposure, or more, putting herself in, like you said, in risk or danger. So that aspect of who she is and her place in society also contributes to what she does, but also this is not just, like we said, like just keep on praying and, tenacity. I mean, this is, she is taking some risk in this, and she is living into even more vulnerability. And I think that puts some perspective on what does persistence or tenacity look like when it comes to faith.
I think that at the very least, in terms of preaching, if someone chooses to preach on this parable this coming week, at least put it in context that just in a couple more chapters, Jesus is going to have a prayer that's not answered. And that David and Moses, Paul, have prayers that aren't answered. And likewise, will he delay long in helping them? Like the psalmists are always going, how long? It's like, you're sort of delaying a lot, God. So at least put it in broader canonical perspective then. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, there's no easy promise here. I think that's got to be clearly said. I just want to say I like this around Election Day in particular, when people are thinking about losing heart, but it also gets to the question of what's the church's vocation. A way to say, as important as Election Day might be in this country, it's not the only way in which the church, the only place where the church places its hope. The church's role in advocacy is there prior to, thereafter Election Day, no matter who's in office. The church always
will continue
positions itself like this widow.
Yeah, well, the church will continue to seek justice and to persist in justice. In justice, not persist in justice. Okay, all right. In justice, toward justice, right? And that happens now, but it's also the promise after. Clearly the promise after the election, but also the promise after the resurrection. I mean, I think, one of the significant aspects of this parable is that it does give us a glimpse of what does discipleship look like when you carry the mission of Jesus' disciples past the end of Luke and into Acts. And what is that going to look like then for going to the ends of the earth for the sake of the witness of the gospel? So it's a characteristic of discipleship that is not just present in this immediate future, but it's also something that's going to be necessary so that the kingdom of God can be extended. Acts 1:8.
Oh, I like that. Good, thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I also love Genesis 32, where Jacob wrestles with God at the Jabbok.
Yeah.
which is our text. So it's obviously paired as, somebody contending with God.
Persistence.
That the nature of faith is struggle.
Yeah, and that's, I think, and you use that phrase, Matt, about like contending with God, and that this is part of our relationship with God. And that could be in a sermon in and of itself to say, because to what extent nobody really, wins this wrestling match.
I think Jacob wins.
You think Jacob wins?
Yeah, hands down.
Hands
We've had this
down?
fight before, though, years and years.
Yeah,
in the
but
podcast.
I'm changing my mind.
Yeah, I think Jacob wins.
You think he wins? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the Bible loves Jacob.
Who? What?
I think Genesis loves Jacob and has nothing bad to say about him, as much as we might be repulsed by him, I think.
What do you think?
I think,
Well, he has a, but he,
Rolf,
like,
this
he
is
has
where
a
Rolf
limp.
usually says, "You're both right."
exactly. I think he's tastefully named. Okay, that wasn't funny apparently. Because my last name is Jacobson, see.
Oh, I get it.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
But I think Jacob is a complete jackass.
Can we say that online?
We can
did.
say
just
that
did.
because that is a
It's like-
reference to an animal, right?
Yes, right.
And
Yeah.
so he tricks his brother out of first his birthright, which is an inheritance issue, right? That the older son gets an extra share. So if there's two sons, the older son is going to get 2/3 and the younger son 1/3. So Jacob tricks him out of that and then steals his blessing. And in Genesis, the blessing is the plot line, because Abraham has promised a blessing and that his descendants will be blessed to be a blessing. And then it tracks through who gets the blessing is the plot line. And so you get then Jacob steals that blessing and wins it from Isaac. But then here the blessing comes up again. So to connect the plot line of Genesis, that Jacob has had to flee for his own life from his brother because of what a jerk he was. And now he's coming back and he still thinks he can manipulate the system, by sending a bribe ahead of himself to Esau. And then that God shows up there. What I like about the story is that God's showing up right when Jacob still hasn't learned anything, I think, about himself or his brother or God. And in there, it's in that encounter is God showing up for Jacob and for the rest of the world through Jacob in the long run.
Yeah, I think he learned pretty well, and that's why he keeps winning. I mean, it's for all of his what we consider his moral shortcomings. He understands the life of faith is to contend like hell for the blessing. Maybe his problem is that the blessing can only go to one person, and so it's a zero-sum game, right? If Jacob gets the blessing, others won't, which is what we don't like about it. But yeah, I just think that I think this passage shows he's learned the lesson quite well. I mean, he's this classic, not just a trickster, but one who is so determined to either get blessed or just to know God. And he does that through struggle. So I'm not saying we should all go out and be like him.
We shouldn't?
Well, I don't know. I am a younger brother, so I kind of admire the way he operates. But you guys are like middle children, firstborn.
No, I'm firstborn.
Yeah,
Middle
Anyway.
child.
I always had the blessing. Yeah.
Oh gosh. Anyway, it's a great text in pairing with the story of the widow of Luke 18. It's also a great text, of course, on its own, because it gets into that question of the nature of faith and when God seems either absent or reluctant to act in the way that we would expect, or we wonder where are God's promises. It doesn't fix it. It doesn't say you wrestle them out of God necessarily, but this is the story of Israel, right? The life of faith is contending.
And that's so different than what we're usually told, is that faith is submitting to God. Passively, meekly submitting to God. And you just got to figure out God's plan for your life and then, just submit to that. Israel's faith, the faith that Jesus passes on to us, in the parable, is in the active contending with God. And so in that sense, I like the pairing.
Yeah, and I think that would be worth a sermon and worth thinking about, that what does it reveal about the nature of faith? Because that contrast of that passive faith, if faith is something that we have, versus, not necessarily versus, but faith is also something that we do, and that does require a certain, this contending with God, or this persistence, I think is worth exploring with people. And the other thing I would add to that too is you get then this whole play on chapter. See, this is what he also did. Did you see that? The other thing that I think is important about this passage in relationship to what does it reveal, what do we see about God, is this this play on Peniel, which means face of God, for I have seen God face to face. And so another aspect of this text is what is revealed about God. God's okay with this contention. God's okay with, God shows up and sort of says, okay, let's do this. And that's something that we see about God. We see a characteristic about God that we maybe don't think about very often.
Well, and the Psalm 121 helps us keep God in the forefront of all of this. It's finally not about our own, machinations or our ability to manipulate God, but finally, my help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Finally, there's at least the Psalm maybe puts a check on some of those other texts to remind us that finally it is the power of God that is our only hope.
I would use this psalm liturgically.
Really?
I'm not sure how.
Beginning of the service, end of the service, confession? That's
a good question. I mean, I think it depends on where your sermon goes. But as you said, it gives this promise of, yes, this is who God is. And so I think it depends on how you want it to function. But I know I suggest that a lot, but it's a beautiful psalm. And I think it's worth having a very significant location in the worship service, and not just sort of embedded into, Old Testament Psalm, New Testament Gospel, usual fare.
My people have this wonderful thing we call a call to worship that we do in the
We
Presbyterian
do too,
Church.
sometimes.
Not always, but it's a great. This would be the way I would start the service.
That's a great.
Right,
that's
some
a great
kind
idea.
of where will my help? I look my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come?
That's a
my
great
help comes
idea.
from the Lord who made heaven and earth. This could easily then move into confession, and then anyway. I've got it all figured out. It's in my head.
So email Matt about that.
I've got your order of service ready to go.
Yeah, but then I would use maybe the first two verses as a call to worship, as you just said, but then the last ones as the benediction at the end of the
Yes,
service.
I was just thinking that.
Brilliant.
Because what was that?
That was brilliant.
Oh wow, thank you. It's
The
Caroline's
audience is going to
idea, so we're just stealing her touchdown call.
Yeah.
So, but the overwhelming sense of the promise and the blessing that we leave with, because God is our keeper, and there's just great images here for who God's the one who doesn't let us stumble. God is the one who keeps us, and it's the same word here that you get in Psalm 130 as more than watchers for the morning. It's that the image of the guard, and
He has his Hebrew up here, by the way.
yeah, I'm not like
He's not checking his
I'm
email.
not playing my fantasy sports on the computer.
Or posting on
The,
Facebook.
It's the principle of repetition, that you get the word shamar, keep, 6 times in the psalm in the second half. And the first 3 times it's God's identity. It's the participle. God is the keeper, and then it moves to God's activity on our behalf. God will keep, or may God keep. So it's moving from God's character to the actions that are then characteristic of God in our life. We need to
Move on.
We should move. Just a quick word about Jeremiah 31 for those who are from traditions that use the semi-continuous path. Here we are. This is the end of year 3. So, next...
Is this it?
Well, I mean, it's at the end. And the idea is that Jeremiah, the narrative parts of Jeremiah, finish the story that has run from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. 2 Kings ends with the king being released in in Babylon from prison and given a place of honor at the king's table. But then Jeremiah, the narrative parts, continue that story, and it really points forward to God keeping the promise. So it's the promise of the new covenant, that the king's been released and God is not done with Israel yet. So.
Okay.
Good. Some people are working through 2 Timothy. God bless them. Tough book. It gets repetitive, but I mean, here's this. This is 3:14 to 4:5 is part of a larger section, kind of 3:10 to 4:8. But it will again emphasize this notion of persistence. In this case, the call is for Timothy and by extension others in leadership or even others in the church to continue to persist. As 2 Timothy puts it, in the sound doctrine and the truth, but also in Paul's own example, which is held up so prominently in this letter. I would argue too, though, that it's also persisting in knowing who you are. This is the letter that started off praising Lois and Eunice, Timothy's relatives who apparently were instrumental in passing the faith along to him. There's a way in which I think the letter is telling Timothy how close faith is to him. It's part of his genes, it's part of his relationships, it's part of his family. And that can be really powerful to some individuals in some congregations. It can be a lot more damaging in others. So it makes us kind of rethink a family of faith, or those from whom we've inherited these things.
Yeah, and if you were carrying on this this theme of being persistent in faith, you do have that language in chapter 2, which is or verse 2, which is words to Timothy. But also, I think, along with what you said, Matt, verse 5, as for you, always, maybe a better translation, keep your head. Endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, carry out your ministry fully. I mean, that's that sort of fivefold sense of what does it mean to be persistent could be another way to think about what is persistence in faith. What does that actually look like? And so you get some sort of particularities in verse 5. I think the other direction you could go with this passage is the oft quoted 2 Timothy 3:16, all scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, which can be translated a number of different ways. But the way in which, inspired the claims, this gets to the kinds of claims we make about the Bible. This is one of those passages that people say, see, the Bible is the inspired word of God. The Bible is the inerrant and infallible word of God, and of course the word inspired there means God breathed, theopneustos, but of course all Scripture is referring to not the New Testament because it wasn't in existence, but the Old Testament, right? The Hebrew Bible. So, so it could be sometimes preaching is a corrective. And invites different kinds of conversations around the Bible and around what we think about the Bible. And so I would imagine that a lot of our listeners say, well, John, 2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is inspired by God. To put that back into its context and to unpack that a little bit, and maybe even to invite, what do we think about, what is Timothy saying about Scripture, and how is it that we understand our authority of Scripture, and what does that mean for our lives, and how does it actually inform and shape our faith and actually our persistence in faith?
You know how I would use this scripture, Karoline?
What? Liturgically?
I would use it liturgically. Like, for instance, if I were leading worship at 3 o'clock in the afternoon at a preaching conference, I would maybe close with this: proclaim the message. Be persistent whether the time is favorable or unfavorable. Convince, rebuke, encourage with the utmost patience.
Closure.
Come on.
So that's always the challenge: is who's going to close,
Or knowing when we're done.
Whether the time is
You've all been
unfavorable.
there. Yeah, you've all been there in text study where everybody's looking around like, I think we're done here. Somebody goes, I have a meeting, and
So that's there's the podcast for next week. So thanks for participating. And now we're happy to call up Larry, and there's the mic. Thanks, Larry. Is this my water? Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind just saying a word that we can use as a promo
Oh,
the
for this?
podcast, because that is.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Why don't you say that, Rolf?
Okay, so we have, we know not everybody here is a preacher in the United States or an American citizen, but this is the most confounding election cycle since I started paying attention to politics at age 3, when Hubert Humphrey ran for president. But we've recorded a special edition of Sermon Brainwave that can be found in our Craft of Preaching section, right, Ben? Just about the challenges of being a faithful preacher in this election cycle. If you might find it interesting, or I mean, you might even just be the sort of thing you might play for a Bible study group. Where people disagree about politics. Obviously, we don't tell people how to vote because that would be to lose our tax status. But we hope there's something helpful maybe. It helped us to think through what biblical preaching is in the time of a very confounding election cycle.
Yeah. So look for that. Yeah.
Are we ready to go?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Well, I'm Larry Strenge. I serve as one of our Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA's Directors for Evangelical Mission in the Southwestern Minnesota Synod, and I want to welcome all of you to this Craft of Preaching podcast that follows after podcast, I believe it was number 506, that this group has put together. And I'm here with Karoline Lewis, Matt Skinner, and Rolf Jacobson, the hosts of Sermon Brainwave. And we're going to do some work on getting behind the scenes of what goes into one of those podcasts. And grateful that all of you can participate in that. This will be about 20 minutes long, so if you wanted to start that up again, Rolf,
absolutely.
that would be helpful. What we'll do is we'll have some conversation up here, but if you have a question that you'd have for Karoline, for Matt, or for Rolf, I'd invite you to make your way to one of the 2 microphones in the aisles, and we'll recognize you at a portion in time in here and bring your conversation into this as well. So with that in mind, I'd like to get started. I have been doing some research. And thanks to Ben McDonald Coltvet, I was able to find out he's the editor and the web content manager for Working Preacher here with us.
There he is.
Does
Give
great
him a
work.
hand.
Yeah, you bet.
Ben, yay, Ben.
That since that first podcast that you were at, Matt, and you were at Karoline, and Rolf, you would have come along about 3 months later when Matt went on his sabbatical. Since that first podcast, which was 10 and a half minutes long, this...
Holy cow.
Yeah, I checked.
And that was 26 minutes.
All right. So I'm going to actually find out about when you decided to...
We've gotten smarter.
You have. Yeah. You have gotten a lot smarter. I know, I've been following this. So anyway, it's expanded, but not only has the length of what you've had to share with us has expanded, but listener audience has expanded. In case you don't know this, 3.5 million people visit the Working Preacher website in a year. So that's all of the Working Preacher website, and Ben wasn't able to break down how many people are tuning in specifically to hear the Sermon Brainwave, but I have a feeling that a pretty good number of people are doing that. So as I thought about that, and the fact that you, Karoline, and Matt were there from the beginning, Rolf came in again about 3 months in when you took your sabbatical, Matt, it made me curious just the fact that, Karoline, you've been there for all 506 podcasts.
I know, right?
All 506. And so it just really made me curious. How have you stayed fresh through all of this? So that, I thought about Joe Madden, the coach for the Cubs. They're the winningest team in baseball this year. And every night on his scorecard, he writes, "Never permit pressure to exceed pleasure." So I just want to hear about that from you first, and then from you, Matt and Rolf, how you've been able to do that, to stay fresh.
Well, I think actually it goes back to Matt's comment about we're getting smarter. And I think that's in part true, in that your ongoing engagement with the biblical text and your own growth as a scholar, your research interests and the directions that your scholarship takes, the way that you push yourself into different areas of your discipline, and also, and for me, also my growth is as a teacher of preachers. I think that all does keep it fresh, because I'm seeing different things in the text based on other reading that I'm doing or other research interests that I have, but I'm seeing different things in the text because I'm teaching preachers, and so how is it that I model or help them think about how do you approach these texts in a fresh way? And so I think that's my first answer to that, is your own growth actually elicits freshness. And you have to be, to use the word we've been using, persistent in that, but I think there is something to be said for that the attention to your research interests and those kinds of questions just bring a different perspective to the text each and every time.
Matt, like to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that I come to this work always really conscious of who I am as a Bible scholar, and that I'm not a week in and week out preacher like most people in this room are, which allows me, so I'm formed by a world that looks at the biblical text and says, figure out what it means, write about it, and then move on to the next one, and that's a horrible way to think about preaching, where it's just always solve the text and then move on. And so I'm aware of that and try to kind of jolt myself out of that way of thinking when I do the podcasts. I know I don't preach as much as all of you, but I spend a lot of time reading the Bible because it's my job.
We're glad to hear that.
Yeah, well, and part of that is you have to love to do it. So I get energized around preaching in scriptures because I really enjoy the engagement. So I remind myself that it's supposed to be fun, that it's supposed to be challenging and enjoyable. But then I also just pay attention to the way in which I'm certain that every time I first read a text or start to think about it, that I've just replicated what I thought about that text last time I read it. And so I kind of go through a process where I kind of force myself to consider a different perspective, whether that's a different view that I know is there in scholarship, or just to say, is there a character or a detail in this text that I'm sure I've overlooked? That might not be the most important thing, but might just be a moment where all of a sudden the text will turn for me like in a kaleidoscope and I'll see something new. So some of it for me is just that discipline of recognizing that my training isn't always the most helpful thing for preaching, and to kind of force myself to go through some of those steps.
Rolf?
Yeah, I think it's three things for me. Well, four. I mean, I use Old Spice body wash to stay fresh. I thought you should know that. Pure sport.
Tax exempt status
I'm
right
a pure
there.
sport person. I think first of all that we love each other, the three of us. Aww. And well, I couldn't do this if I didn't, and we tell each other that regularly, and so that I couldn't come to do this if I didn't really like being with these two people. You've all been part of a text study with that person, right? And you've all been that person to somebody else. So it's the relationship. Second of all, I really value what you all do. And so to know that someone is listening, and it might help one preacher this week, keeps it fresh. Because I mean, I went into ministry because I believed in the power of preaching, and then I went on to do my degree in Old Testament because I believed, and I wanted to then serve other preachers and get a sabbatical sometimes. So to know, I mean, to value what people do, it keeps it fresh. But also then, I have intentionally tried to cultivate in myself the theological virtue of curiosity, that I always have something new to learn from the text. Like Karoline today said, what would persistent, don't lose your head, or was it keep your head, you said? I mean, that's sort of that's a different way to think about persistence. So I'm always learning things from Matt and Karoline and our online, the columnists that we read. So.
Well, thank you. Well, I think we have experienced that vulnerability in all three of you, sharing stories from your past. I'm thinking about a few weeks ago, Rolf, you shared about the fact that you live life mostly in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
And that was, I remember it was a situation where Jesus had healed this woman, and you shared that, and it really brought a different level of our appreciation for the text. So thank you for all of you dealing in that. I'm a pretty constant listener to Krista Tippett on Being, and have enjoyed her books, and her latest book is one called Becoming Wise. And I was captured by something she said in the closing paragraphs of the introduction of that book, where she said, surprise is the only constant. Surprise is the only constant. And so I was thinking about your work in Sermon Brainwave, and just wondering, what do you consider personally that you found that just kind of surprises you about this work?
You didn't tell me you were going to ask that.
That wasn't in our pre-conversation,
right.
Was it?
Surprise!
I think that probably what continues to surprise me is that the ancient text still can speak into my reality and into other people's reality. You forget that. You forget the wonder of it. Mm-hmm. And then, you can be surprised over and over again by the way that, like you said, like that. Okay, I was really surprised. I remember talking about being handicapped and healing stories, and I've gotten more positive feedback from that thing which was a couple weeks ago, than from all of any other one thing. More positive feedback from that comment than from any other comment. And I won't tell you about the negative feedback that Matt gets.
We knew it was coming in.
No, it's so that's my surprise.
I would say, excuse me, that everything that my two friends said about the first question is kind of a joyful surprise, that I do learn things. I often come to this, I'll circle things on the text or in my notes that I know that Rolf or Karoline are going to say. Like I can read them in advance, and they probably do the same with me. But then to be able to push them on things, or ask them to rephrase things, or to consider a different direction, and the fact that we do that together. And it usually works pretty well. Sometimes we'll make faces at each other across the table, but but yeah, there's a way in which even three people with whatever, our perspectives or our egos or whatever we have to lose, are still able to find new things with these texts when we're together. It's not a surprise, I didn't expect that, but it's a joyful surprise when it happens, because we can't always script it. I'm also genuinely surprised, this isn't maybe about the preparation as much as just the positive response we get, which isn't necessarily about us, but it's a constant reminder, again, a joyful reminder of just how hard this work is of preaching a day in and day out. the lack of interpersonal connection that a lot of preachers have in their settings, either because other local pastors won't talk to them or can't, or geography plays into that, whatever. Just to be part of something that's useful when you're a scholar is a weird thing, because you spend most of your day, staying in your office. You teach students who go off and do great things, and you hope to hear from them, but you trust that what you're doing works. And we record this thing in a basement with gray walls. I mean, it's
a pod.
We have fun because it's just us. But to know that, I'll get biblical, to know that your words don't always fall to the ground is a tremendous gift. And you all know what that's like when a sermon comes back to you through a comment, either at the door or 3 weeks later or whatever. That's just a kind of vocational surprise or joy that is.
Yeah.
It's fine. It happens more intensely in this work than anything else I do.
I have two. My first surprise is always what people think I look like. So that's when they haven't seen a picture of me or something, and and they've been listening to me for a while, and that's what you look like. So I'm always surprised to know how they envision how I look according to my voice. I think my surprise actually is really personal, in that I surprise myself in terms of what God reveals in this text each and every week. And what I'm able to see, not necessarily my own ability, but then that I'm able to see and experience something different each and every week. And it surprises me that the Spirit surprises me, that the Spirit shows up, and
That's good as a Lutheran scholar.
Yeah, I know, because we don't talk about the Spirit very often, but the Spirit shows up, and those moments when, I look at a text and go, wow, how many times have I read this text? And yet now I'm seeing something that I haven't seen before. And of course that's contextual, and it has to do with what I said earlier about your own growth and such. But I'm in many ways, I'm surprised that I can still be surprised.
All right. Well, thank you. I see that we have somebody from our audience that would like to offer a question.
Yeah. How do you approach the character of God piece when it is counter to people's normal understanding? Oh, there I am. I'll start from the beginning. How do you approach a character of God piece when it is counter to people's normal understanding? For instance, you mentioned God desires a faith that is wrestling instead of what we typically hold as the smarmy faith, and this can be very difficult for people to encounter if they're not used to it.
I think I can answer that personally or in the context of the podcast. In the podcast, I consider it my gift to my two colleagues to try to be one who pushes the God question all of the time. So what finally is the character of God? Not that they never do this, but implied by this text, which, with certain texts, consider the semi-continuous reading when you're going through Old Testament narrative, for example. It can be harder to do. What do you do when Absalom dies? I mean, that's a very poignant text, but then find a push question of who is God. I like the way in which the Bible provokes and dislodges some of my expectations that I bring to it, and so I'll try to bring those up. When it comes to, for a preacher then, those things never change in one sermon, right? You all know that. You can't just finally say, faith is really like this and not like that. That takes, years of reminders in that regard. But I think that for me it starts exegetically. It starts reading a text and asking questions. Who is the God assumed by this text, or how does God appear in this text? And what does, I'm a good Presbyterian, right? So every statement about God is also a statement about human beings and vice versa. What does it say about us? What does it say about the nature of humanity? Who your God is going to affect your understanding of who you are.
Yeah, I think it's a willingness to allow the text to speak, and the story or the text might not always agree with you. And and the text you have, maybe you'd like to be able to shape it and form it in the text you wish you had rather than the one you had. And usually, we say it's challenging we have those, what we say, difficult texts, right? But to what extent all texts are difficult if you find that they are not lining up to your own theological commitments? And those are the texts that sort of rub you the wrong way and say, wow, that's not who I think God is. And I think part of preaching is to be willing to admit that, or to know your own theological commitments and assumptions. And so your discomfort with the text is usually often because you've recognized a discontinuity between what you believe and what the text is saying. But I also think as preachers, it's really important to recognize and to preach the breadth and depth of the biblical witness. And so we all have a canon within a canon. We all have certain texts that we like and don't like. But are we willing to preach the witness of a particular text that goes maybe against our own personal theology, but also our church, our ecclesial theology, as well as our denominational theology, and say, yeah, but this is one witness to who God is. So I think it's important to be willing to preach that breadth, even when it might be a little bit uncomfortable for us.
I could answer that question in so many different ways. I'll just really be brief, 2 ways. First of all, my specialty is Psalms, and I think that's what the Psalms are constantly about, the character of God. And the character of God in the Psalms is, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. And so the psalmists are always saying, hey, God, you're supposed to be these things, and why am I not experiencing you that way? Or they're teaching us what it means to be in a relationship with that kind of God. Really briefly, the other, I face a challenge that my colleagues don't, in that sometimes people will come up to me and tell me that my vocation is wrong, because they say, I don't believe Christians should preach on the Old Testament, or we shouldn't read the Old Testament, right? It's like, well, thank you for demeaning my entire vocation like that. So that gives me a chance to just kind of reflect back and help people reflect on how the Old Testament does still bear God and is a means of grace.
One other thing I've been curious about is the limitations that you've come up to as you've done this podcast. I know, Matt, when you and I spoke, or maybe it was you and I, Rolf, you mentioned about events that would come up. So in today's podcast, you were talking about the election coming up. What have you considered doing if there's some major event that comes up that would just change the tenor of what you've said in the podcast? Have you considered anything like that?
Yeah, we have talked about this, but because a podcast has to get recorded and then edited and posted, we have to do it, like we're doing this one for next week. Mm-hmm. And some people like to listen ahead if they can. I don't know, is that possible, Ben, on the website? So we've talked about, if 9/11 were to happen tomorrow, we'd probably have to re-record this podcast. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I don't think we've ever done that, have we? We've never.
Pardon me? Oh, we did?
Yeah. So maybe once.
We have in the past done that, and we would get together, and reflect on how these texts are now speaking entirely differently because of that situation. But it's timely, but probably not as timely as. It's not as timely as those moments when you have your sermon done on Saturday night and you get a call in the middle of the night that something's happened and your sermon goes out the window and you start over again and hope for the best on Sunday morning, right? So.
Yeah, it's the biggest frustration that it's a rather generic resource to help preachers. So recently, Luke 16, the story of the rich man Lazarus, was the gospel text, and I believe there were 2 shootings of unarmed black men in the United States that week. And we had recorded, had I been preaching, that's a topic that would have found a way to interact with the sermon. Also, our audience is really global. Most of our listeners, as far as we can tell, are from North America, but it's a global audience, and so it's hard. So it's a bit of a frustration, but I think we remind ourselves that the purpose of this podcast is not to be the be-all and end-all of anybody's sermon prep, but it's to start a conversation. And so that's when I feel guilty about the podcast not being timely enough or focused enough or edgy enough. That's how I assuage my guilt, I guess.
And I think we are conscious of the ways in which we're lifting up certain themes that can speak into different kinds of situations. So that and like Matt said, we can't speak into everything, and we are very much aware that this is not, we're not just a North American resource. I mean, this is a global resource, and so. But I do hope, and I do trust, and I think we are very conscious of the fact that we are lifting up those themes, that are paying attention to those themes that can make their way into how you are making sense of a certain situation theologically.
Well, we're coming up against our time, but we do have time for one last question.
So this is just a comment. You talk about it being generic, but actually that's a gift to us as preachers, because we go back and listen to what you said 3 years ago and 6 years ago to get sort of a variety. So it's okay that it's not always really specific to a situation, because that might not work for us the next time around.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good.
Really?
That's my biggest fear, that somebody listens to 3 and 6-year-old ones, because I'm afraid I've said the exact same thing.
In general, don't do that.
We recognize how kind of one-dimensional in some ways we are as a lineup. But
well, we are grateful for your hard work and helping us in this online text study, and for sharing with us today by being vulnerable about what goes on behind the scenes. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. We have about a 15-minute break until 11 o'clock. We have worship at 11 o'clock with Tom Long preaching. Immediately following his sermon, he will go into his sermon analysis. So 11 o'clock here, worship begins. Thanks. Thank you, Larry.
Thanks,
That
Larry.
was great.